Walk through the Van Wickle gates of Brown University today, and you are greeted by an architectural sermon in red brick and ivy, a landscape designed to whisper of provident dependency and the sanctification of the soul. Yet the institution breathing inside these walls would be unrecognizable to the men who laid the first stones. This is the story of a movement that became a museum, a chronicle of how an academic fortress built to defend the sovereignty of God was systematically dismantled to make room for the sovereignty of the self. It is the narrative of an architected soul where the metaphysical anchor of the gospel was slowly traded for the universal prestige of a secular age. The history of Brown University is not merely a chronicle of an Ivy League institution's growth. It is a profound case study in the life cycle of a foundational idea. Today we explore the architectural and intellectual shifts of an institution that began as a learned ministry to defend a marginalized faith and transitioned into a bastion of the open curriculum, where the sovereignty of the student eventually supplanted the sovereignty of the creator. By examining the metamorphosis of Brown University, we observe the broader tension in American higher education, the delicate balance between maintaining a specific confessional identity and the siren song of academic value neutrality. The story of Brown is the story of a covenantal pedagogy that once viewed the faculty for the sanctification of the soul, only to eventually rebrand its sacred spaces as multi-purpose event spaces, and its commencement ceremonies as hollow stages for a secular age. The genesis of Brown University was rooted in 18th century evangelical intentionality. To understand its inception, one must look to the strategic maneuvers of James Manning in the Philadelphia Association. This was not education for social prestige. It was a defensive intellectual maneuver. The founders recognized that without a learned ministry, the Baptist faith would suffer intellectual marginalization in a landscape dominated by state-supported denominations. The college was conceived as an academic fortress to defend and articulate a specific living faith. The core of the institution's identity resided in the En Diosperamus mandate, in God we hope. Far from a decorative sentiment, this phrase served as a rigorous, ontological anchor, codifying a state of providential dependency. It established the university as a subordinate entity beneath the creator, asserting that every academic pursuit was inherently secondary to the overarching governance of the Almighty. The founders, led by men like Morgan Edwards and Isaac Backus, believed the human mind existed in intellectual fragmentation. Without alignment with its supernatural source, reason was viewed as drifting and incomplete. This vertical orientation meant that physics, logic, and rhetoric were lesser lights meant to reflect the Son of Righteousness, Jesus Christ. Academic rigor was a discipline of sanctified observation, where the scholar's task was to think God's thoughts after him. While birthed from Baptist conviction, the charter contained a unique ecumenical provision. This structural openness functioned as a calculated immunology of the institution. By architecting a multi-denominational framework, founders like Stephen Hopkins and the Brown brothers erected a pluralistic bulwark that prevented any singular state-aligned prelacy from achieving a hostile takeover. In this strategic ecumenism, the board's diversity served as a decentralized guardrail, making the university too broad to subdue, yet too grounded to drift. The open door of the charter was actually a gated community of believers designed to keep the secular state at bay, while the internal mission, led by President James Manning, remained singular and unyielding. The mechanism for ensuring this mission remained confessionally tethered was the pastor-scholar leadership model. The charter explicitly required the president to be a Baptist minister, ensuring the head was a person of intellectual rigor and theological commitment. This filtered down into a covenantal pedagogy, a three-way agreement between God, the church, and the student. Under this model, the faculty acted for the sanctification of the soul. The classroom was a sanctuary where the primary indicator was experimental religion, a personal experience of conversion. The physical architecture reflected this. University Hall was designed as a sacred enclosure, intended to insulate the young scholar from profane distractions to focus on the vertical relationship with God. The 19th century marked the golden age of Brown's institutional identity, a period where academic expansion was the highest form of worship. The zenith arrived under President Francis Wayland, who championed the absolute supremacy of moral science. Wayland asserted that the Decalogue functioned as the immutable constitutional law governing human cognition. No discipline existed in a vacuum. Whether political economy or natural philosophy, the objective was to decipher the moral statutes of the Creator. Under Wayland's direction, academic excellence remained moored within a confessional harbor. His seminal textbooks posited that the totality of human discovery was merely a cognitive subdivision of an infinite divine wisdom. Brown synthesized a unitary worldview, providing a metaphysical compass that transformed the student experience into a high calling of character, stewardship. The mid-19th century expansion under Barnes Sears and Alexis Caswell signaled a transition toward common grace. This era birthed edifices honoring human advancement in the arts and sciences. This was not secularism. It was a manifestation of the dominion mandate from Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, the divine charge to fill the earth and subdue it. The construction of Manning Hall, modeled after a Greek temple, epitomized this philosophy. It housed both a sanctuary and a library, a calculated maneuver to demonstrate that revelation and reason were inseparable facets of a singular reality. There was no profane territory, only terrain awaiting reclamation for the kingdom. The university's expansion was propelled by a formidable denominational engine. Affluent Baptist lineages, most prominently the Brown family, categorized their philanthropy as a kingdom investment. This confessional capital grew because benefactors trusted the institution as a loyal guardian of their theological tenets. Structural oversight was maintained through church governance, ensuring no loss in spiritual velocity. A secondary technique involved a stringent orthodoxy vetting. Faculty were required to embody lived piety, serving as moral exemplars within the community. As the century waned under Ezekiel, Gilman Robinson, and Elisha Benjamin Andrews, a seismic reconfiguration commenced, the rise of the specialist. The impetus shifted from the holistic formation of the soul toward the clinical information of the mind. With the German research model, unified truth began to disintegrate into autonomous departments. The faculty member was no longer a pastor-scholar, a guardian of a covenant, but was reimagined as a technician of the particular. Mastery was measured by narrow expertise in a secularized silo. This epistemological partitioning effectively severed the nerves connecting the laboratory to the chapel. The mid-20th century functioned as the pivot of secularization. The era of William Herbert Perry Faunce served as the definitive bridge. A celebrated Baptist preacher, Faunce oversaw the transition into a new age. While he maintained the language of faith, his tenure prioritized universal prestige. He was the architect of institutional velocity, building the physical monument of the Ivy League, while the founding mission began its subtle evaporation. The most significant structural blow was the movement to amend the original charter. For over a century, the requirement that the president be a Baptist minister served as the confessional tether. However, the mechanism of change was the argument for academic liberty. Proponents suggested the Baptist requirement was an anachronistic barrier to recruiting elite administrative talent. By decoupling the presidency from the Baptist pulpit, the university effectively severed its confessional lineage. Under Henry Wriston, the path for leadership became managerial competence rather than theological stewardship. The head of the institution was no longer a pastor-scholar guarding a covenant, but a chief executive officer navigating a market. The Baptist core was replaced by a generic Protestantism that eventually faded into a vague humanism. Theological drift was characterized by the eclipse of special grace. In the founding era, the gospel was the necessary cognitive key to true understanding. By the 1940s, a new consensus emerged. Common grace, secular ethics, and social cooperation was sufficient. The university began to view its mission as the improvement of society rather than the sanctification of the soul. As the internal spirit moved towards secularism, the forms of its heritage were preserved as linguistic residuals. Under Barnaby Keeney, The chapel service transitioned from a mandatory prostration to a voluntary exercise in spiritual wellness. The technique was museumification, maintaining the aesthetic of the sacred while surgically removing its authority. The First Baptist Meeting House began to function as a hollow stage. The ritual remained, the robes remained, and the Latin remained, but the sacred intent had been evacuated. This institutional mimicry allowed the university to maintain prestige while operating with a secular heartbeat. It was no longer a movement advancing a faith. It had become a museum housing artifacts. The vacuum was filled by a new ethic of inclusion, in reality, a form of pluralistic indifference. The university championed diversity as an end in itself, believing the school should be a value-neutral marketplace of ideas where all perspectives are equally valid and equally temporary. This environment ensured that any holding to a particular truth was viewed as unenlightened. The open door of the 18th century had become a revolving door where everything was welcome except for the exclusive claims of Jesus Christ which birthed the institution. The late 20th century represents the final transition from a movement, a living mission, to a monument, a hollowed-out institutional machine. Under the leadership of Ray Hefner, the university underwent a deliberate metaphysical revolution. The motivation was the total rejection of revealed truth in favor of individual autonomy. The mission was no longer a living breath, it was becoming a prestigious machine. The most visible mechanism was the adoption of the open curriculum in 1969. While marketed as innovation, it functioned as the ultimate confessional divorce. By removing core requirements, the university signaled that there was no longer a unified body of knowledge or a divine order that every student must encounter. The vertical orientation was officially leveled. This pedagogy enthroned the student as the primary arbiter of truth. Education was no longer a journey towards sanctification, under a faculty acting as a guide to Jesus Christ. It became a consumerist experience. The covenantal nature of the school was replaced by a contractual one, where internal desires dictated reality. The decline of the vertical was illustrated in spiritual leadership. The university chaplain transitioned from a pastoral authority to a multi-faith coordinator tasked with spiritual wellness. Under Vartan Gregorian, inclusion became the new high priestly virtue. The duty was no longer to guard the deposit of faith, but to ensure all subjective truths felt accommodated. As Baptist zeal evaporated, it was replaced by a secular gospel centered on identity and social justice. This new orthodoxy adopted the method of religious fervor, dogmas, and rituals, but without a transcendent source. Having abandoned the Great Commission, the university adopted social engineering as its new redemptive mission. The reason of the institution was reimagined. It no longer existed to prepare souls for eternity, but to prepare activists for the temporal city. The classroom became a laboratory for the collective conscience of the academic community. The metaphysical pivot was complete. The source of morality was no longer the triune God, but the consensus of the age. Today, the First Baptist Meeting House serves as the ultimate atheistic meeting house. It is a hollow stage where the sacred form remains, the high pulpit and the steeple pointing toward heaven, but it serves a secular ceremony unrecognizable to the founders. This institutional mimicry proves the movement has become a museum. Brown University is now an architectural ghost, haunting halls built by men whose convictions the modern institution views as intellectual marginalia. It achieved universal prestige by sacrificing the metaphysical anchor that gave its existence meaning. The monument stands, but the movement is dead. The metamorphosis of Brown University from a covenantal movement to a secular monument serves as a stark warning. It reveals that secularization is rarely a frontal assault. It is a subtle evaporation of the vertical line to the Creator. When the In Deo Speramus mandate was traded for universal prestige, the university did not become neutral. It simply replaced one orthodoxy with another. It traded the sanctification of the soul for the sovereignty of the self, leaving behind an architectural ghost that wears the robes of the past while speaking the language of a fractured present. The monument stands, but the movement is dead. As you consider this trajectory from movement to monument, take a moment to examine your own intellectual and spiritual foundations. In your pursuit of knowledge, excellence, or professional prestige, where is your metaphysical anchor located? Are you building a movement, a life driven by a clear providential purpose? Or are you building a monument, an impressive exterior that has slowly been evacuated of its original sacred intent? True education is not merely the information of the mind, but the formation of the soul. If we lose the vertical authority of the truth, we are left wandering a horizontal plane of subjective desires. We must ask ourselves if we are stewards of a living heritage or merely curators of a dying museum. If this deep dive into the intersection of faith, history, and the architected soul has resonated with you, there is much more to explore. History is not a dead subject. It is the map that explains exactly how we arrived at our current cultural moment. To continue unpacking the why and how behind the shifts in church history and the development of the modern mind, subscribe to Theology Today. Through this channel, we move beyond surface-level summaries to perform in-depth analysis on the figures, confessions, and institutional turning points that shaped our world. Join a community dedicated to reclaiming the revealed heritage and ensuring that our intellectual pursuits remain firmly anchored in Jesus Christ. Don't just watch history happen, understand why it matters. Subscribe to Theology Today.